So I like Labyrinth quite a bit, to the point that I use a lot of my spare time replicating props seen in the movie. I post these prop replicas online, and without a doubt, one of the most popular prop replicas I've made is the Firey Plush, as seen in Sarah's bedroom. I've had a tutorial posted to my blog for a few years now on how to make this guy, but blogs are dead and have been for many years, so I guess 2024 is the year I finally decide to give YouTube tutorials a go. Before we begin, I need to set expectations. I am not a master sewer by any means, nor do I have a ton of experience making sewing patterns. I dabble in a lot of hobbies, which means I learn just enough to get the job done. Jack of all trades and a master of none, that whole thing. So all that to say, I know that there are probably a lot of improvements to be made with this pattern and the tutorial that you're about to see. But I'm trying to follow the idea that something that's imperfect but done is better than something that is never finished because I'm fixated on perfection that I will never be able to achieve. So hopefully, even if this tutorial or the pattern aren't perfect, they can still be of use to folks. So on that note, let's begin. Firstly, you can download the pattern for this Firey from my blog, which I've got linked in the description below. I designed the pattern so that it could be printed out on 8.5 by 11 size printer paper. Some of the long pattern pieces, like the arms, legs, and tail, had to be split into two to fit on the paper, so for those pieces you'll need to follow the guides I included and tape them together. Also, in case there's any funny business when you're printing out the pieces of paper, I included a scale on one of the pages, so if you're not sure if it's printed off at the right size, take a ruler and just try and make sure that the inch mark that I've got on the printed pattern pieces matches the inch mark on your ruler. The fabric I'm using for this Firey is some cotton broadcloth that I got from Fabricland, which is a fabric store up here in Canada that I actually don't know if it exists outside of Canada. But this is the Petal pink color, which, in my opinion anyways, is pretty dang close to the color of the Firey in the film. I think if you wanted a completely accurate Firey, you might want to tint this fabric just a little more red, but I'm too lazy for that, so I just like using the fabric straight off the bolt. I've also got thread that matches the color of my fabric. You can use whatever color works for you, but the specific thread that I use, which is also from Fabricland, is Gutermann 5110. I got 2 meters of fabric here. 1 meter is more than plenty for one single Firey. I just like having extra fabric around in case of screw-ups, or in case I wake up in the dead of night and decide I want to make a Firey. Also apologies, because I am definitely going to be swapping between imperial and metric. I kind of use whatever's easier, you know, whichever one gets me close to a nice round number. Once your fabric is ready, you can trace out the individual pieces of the Firey pattern. I like to use this heat-sensitive pen that I got from Amazon. It allows you to draw on the fabric, and then once you've got things sewn together, you can use an iron to erase the pen lines. It's super helpful for projects like this, where the pattern pieces don't include seam allowance. I'll point out that I've got the fabric folded over here, so it's 2 layers thick. So for these pieces, I'm just drawing the shape out once, and then when I cut them, I'll have 2 pieces for the price of 1. For some of the long pieces, like the arms, legs, and tail, I find it super helpful to actually pin the pieces down before I trace them out. There's a few pieces that you'll have to add some guide marks to, like, for instance, the piece for the back of the head. It's got a very weird shape to it, and I always get a little confused which way is supposed to be up, and I'm the one that made this pattern. So definitely write a little note to yourself which side is meant to be the back seam and which side is meant to be the side seam. I'd also recommend making a note of what body pieces are the front and the back, because they're a very similar shape and, once again, it's easy to confuse. And lastly, make sure to include these little marks on the bottom piece. This is the piece that goes, it's basically the Firey's butt. But make sure to use these little marks. This will help you line things up when you're sewing this piece to the body later on. You'll have to excuse the atrocious scratchiness of my drawn lines, by the way. I realized pretty early on that it's kind of hard to do a lot of things when you've got a camera in between you and your hands, and that doesn't change as the video goes on. In fact, probably gets worse. So please bear with me. Please don't judge me for these terrible drawn lines. Last thing to point out, I slightly modified the ear pattern while I was making this particular Firey. The ear shown for the majority of the video turned out to be just a touch too long, so I went back and I fixed that. I've already updated the pattern itself, I just wanted to make a note of it in case anyone notices the difference in the ear shape. Okay, so with everything drawn out, it's now time to cut the pieces. You can of course use scissors. I personally really like using a rotary cutter and a cutting mat, because it means that I don't have to pin as much. Although maybe I should, and I'm just being lazy here. But anyways, the rotary blade is usually also just a fair bit faster than the scissors. As I'm showing in the video, or, struggling to show, as you are cutting, you want to add seam allowance. The line we traced is the seam line, or the line that we're going to be sewing on. So we need enough seam allowance around that drawn line so that the fabric can be sewn together properly. I think 1/2 inch is usually the commercially recommended seam allowance. I tend to go a bit smaller than that, especially when I'm, once again, struggling to do things with a camera in my face. But don't be like me. Have a decent and even width to your seam allowance. If anything, you can always trim it down a bit later when things have been sewn, but if you have too small of a seam allowance, you definitely risk your fabric getting sucked into your machine. Ask me how I know. I'm really not doing a great job of showing how easy the rotary cutter is. I don't think mine is dull, it's just that I'm doing this at my slightly too tall kitchen island, and I'm a bit on the shorter side, so altogether, I'm just struggling to put enough weight down onto the blade to get a nice clean cut. This video is definitely giving me a new appreciation for craft YouTubers, because doing this stuff on camera makes it way more difficult than it usually is. For the arms and the legs, I'm not cutting the fabric in between the digits, I'm just cutting a general shape around them. Once we get things sewn together, we'll work on freeing the fingers and the toes. So we've got 2 sets of ears, 2 sets of legs, and 2 sets of arms, with 2 pieces, a front and a back, cut for every set. So that's 4 leg pieces, 4 arm pieces, and 4 ear pieces in total. And this is where I realized I forgot to trace and cut the tail, so I quickly went and did that, and so there's 2 pieces for the tail, once again, front and a back. For the body front, body back, head front, and head back, you need to cut 2 pieces each, with each piece mirroring each other. So as a reminder, my fabric was doubled over, and I cut both pieces at the same time, which means I need to go back and make sure I draw the seam line on the second layer of fabric, since of course I only drew it on the topmost layer. And again, you want to make sure that you are mirroring whatever you drew on the topmost layer. The only piece that you need one of is that bottom body piece, so I just save that bit of fabric for whenever I make my next Firey. We're not quite done with the cutting though. My fabric is a bit floppy and I want the ears to have a bit more structure so that they stick out more on the final Firey's head. So I cut 4 more ear pieces out of some iron-on interfacing, which is a material that has an adhesive side that is activated by heat, and that bonds it to fabric and adds a bit of stiffness while doing so. So here I am, following manufacturer's instructions for my particular iron-on interfacing, using a damp cloth in between the interfacing and the iron, and applying heat. If you're doing this like I am, where every earpiece gets some interfacing ironed onto it, you want to make sure that you're being mindful of mirroring the interfacing. So you want to make sure that the pink sides of your ears, or the right sides, are sewn together, so that when you turn things inside out later, the interfacing is hidden on the inside of the ears, or the wrong side of the fabric. And since we use the iron on these pieces, that erased the heat-sensitive line, so I have to redraw on the seam lines. So I just drew them on to the side with the interfacing, because again, you sew right sides together and wrong sides out. So I want the seam line on the wrong side of the fabric. Okay, so we finally got all of our pieces cut and we're ready to sew. We're going to start off with some of the easier parts of sewing a fiery, which are sewing up all the limbs. I'm starting with the arms in this video, but you can sew the limbs in any order you see fit, it doesn't really matter. With all the pieces pinned together, I am sewing on my drawn seam line, and I'm just following that line almost all the way around. You'll want to leave a gap so that you can turn these pieces inside out later on. I would recommend following along where I leave the gaps. For the arms, that's on the palm of the hand, and on the legs, it's like the top of the foot area. To tackle the square corners of each limb, I'm doing the typical sewing thing of sewing to the corner, leaving the needle down in the fabric but raising the presser foot on my sewing machine so that I can then pivot the fabric around the needle where I can then lower the presser foot and resume sewing. Oh, and I guess if I'm mentioning that, I might as well mention for every sewn line I draw, unless I specifically call it out, I am adding a backstitch at the start and end of every stitch line. And that backstitch basically just go back and forth with your sewing machine. That just creates basically like a knot, and that just prevents your sewing from unraveling. With the digits on the hand and foot, I've made the pattern so that there's room for one stitch in between each digit. Eagle-eyed viewers will see that I did 2 stitches on the toes in this video. That ended up being a bit too much for my liking, so I'd recommend just sticking to what's in the pattern, which, again, should be about 1 stitch, depending on your stitch length. So, for the tail, I've left 2 gaps. One a little above the end of the tail, and then the bottommost tail edge. That's because we need to add the yarn tail before sewing up that spot. So with your chosen yarn, you're going to want to cut a bunch of strands. Mine were about 4 inches long here, and once I had enough of a pile, I used some additional yarn to tie the bundle together. I neatened up the ends of the bundle with my scissors, and then used one of the yarn ties to gently pull the bundle into my partially sewn tail, and then kind of pulling it out of the other gap that I had just to get it out of the way. You can see me massaging things a little bit to get everything in place. Then I was ready to go back to the sewing machine to finish sewing this remaining little seam line, and that will secure the yarn tail in place. I then trimmed the extra yarn down and clipped these corners to try and remove some of the bulk. And then because it was too tempting not to, I decided to flip the tail inside out at this point, using my special friend, the pinchy tool. I think I'll put this in the description of the video if anyone wants to get their own. I got mine for, I think it was like 15 bucks, which, not gonna lie, feels a bit expensive. But it's just so helpful for turning things inside out, especially for these fireys where they've got a lot of like little narrow pieces that can be a real pain to turn inside out. I'm basically just like shimmying it a little bit, sort of like a rolling motion, rolling it onto the pinchy tool with my free hand. But once you've got the tail turned inside out, you can remove the extra yarn ties. Except if you're me and you stupidly sewed one into your tail. It's all good though, I figured out a workaround, which is just like, it's basically just cutting the knot, kind of. Yeah, it worked out, it's all good. So now we're going to sew the ears. Simply put, the ears were sewn together, leaving the gap on the edge where the ears will attach to the head. I'm going to turn the ears inside out here, but before I do, I want to make sure to trim some of the seam allowance, including clipping corners and the curves. Doing this helps the fabric lay a little nicer once it's turned inside out. Generally, you want to clip valleys, or the concave curves, and notch mountains, or the convex curves. For my convex curves, I'm using some special scissors to make the notches. I actually don't know if this is how you want to do the convex curves, but I like doing it this way because it's faster and I'm lazy. Anyways, once that's done, you can just turn the ears inside out, which this is once again the return of the pinchy tool. I just love this pinchy tool. It looks a little mad sciencey, and that's part of why I love it. And again, it just makes the fabric really easy to turn. Especially, yeah, like the tight tubes of the arms and legs. So much easier with the pinchy tool. Anyways, with the ears inside out, I ironed them flat. And then while the iron was out, I folded over the ear ever so slightly and then ironed that down. And then I ran that over to my sewing machine where I sewed a few stitches close to the edge so that it's not going to be visible on the final ear, just to lock in that fold. I like doing this because it adds a bit more shape to the ear, although stick around later on because when I redo the ears, because of that aforementioned slightly too long issue earlier, I improved the positioning of the fold quite a bit, so yeah, again, stick around, see how that was done there. And that's the ears done, so we'll set them aside for the time being and move on to some of the harder stuff, like sewing the top of the head to the front of the body. Full disclosure, but sewing these two pieces together at this wavy seam line, and the corresponding wavy seam line for the back of the head and back body pieces, is probably the most frustrating part of this build. That's because, number one, this is just a weird shape to sew, and the fabric pieces like to shift as you're sewing it. And number two, the length of the seam line on one piece doesn't exactly match the length on the other. So you have to gather one side, the front and back head pieces, to make it fit. I'm showing myself manually adding the gathering in the video right now. Gathering is basically adding a bunch of really small folds in your fabric so that the fabric becomes shorter as a result of the folds. So I'm basically just pinning, finding the midpoint between my pins, and then trying to evenly space out the folds along the seam line. And yeah, again, this can be really annoying to sew, because even with all of these pins, the fabric can shift, and after sewing along this seam line, you might think you've nailed it until you turn it over and see that the other side shows that your lines are now super mismatched. This is where I bust out the seam ripper to unpick the stitches in the problem area so that I can try and repin it and re-sew. It does get a bit easier to fix the area when you've already got it partially sewn, but it's still really annoying to have to sew, unpick, re-sew, and then possibly unpick and re-sew again. This is definitely the part of the project where I am reminded that I am an amateur when it comes to sewing and pattern making. I mean, like, someone more experienced would know how to solve this issue or improve the pattern, but I am not that someone. Although something that I tried that did help a bit was, instead of doing my hand gathers, to do some machine gathers instead. So I'll demonstrate this with the back of the head pieces, which, similar to the front, we want to attach these pieces along this wavy, frustrating seam line. First though, I took the back of the head pieces to my sewing machine and I ran a gathering stitch. This is a stitch with no back stitching, and there is no back stitching because we want to be able to pull the dangling thread and scrunch up the fabric, which we couldn't do if we had back stitched. And then you just scrunch the fabric up until things are even and your seam line matches up nicely. It did help a bit to have the fabric pre-gathered. It did at least make it easier to pin these pieces together without having to worry about adding the gathers myself, but I did admittedly still find that I had to unpick and re-sew some of this seam line because I still had that misalignment after I sewed. But it did require less fussing than the hand-gathered side, so I think it's worth it in the end. I realized later on another thing you can do is to do that machine gather, but then hand stitch the seam line together. And by hand stitching it, you have a lot more control over how the fabric is behaving here. If you're really good at hand sewing, you could probably just leave your hand sewn line as is, but if you're like me and you suck at hand sewing, you could run over your hand sewn line with your sewing machine. And because you have already sewn the fabric together, the fabric shouldn't shift. Or at least it shouldn't shift much. But you know what? I'll just say it. The back of the head is going to be covered up with yarn anyways, so if you end up with a less than perfect back of the head, don't sweat it too much. No one will see it in the end. The front of the head is the visible one, so just worry about those seam lines, and whatever happens in the back stays in the back. Anyways, however you do it, you want the back of the headpiece attached to the back body piece, and the front of the headpiece attached to the front body piece. You want to do that to both sides of each half, so I guess these are like quarters of the body. But once you have each quarter of the body sewn, you can then sew the quarters together to make each half. I'm showing the pinning of the front quarters here. You want to make sure that you're matching the positioning of the seams on each quarter of the front of the body. Once it's all pinned, you sew along this front edge, and only the front edge. We need the side seams open so that we can attach the other half of the body, and the bottom edge has to stay open so that we can turn the body inside out. It's basically the same thing for each quarter of the back half of the body. You want to pin and sew these two quarters together along the back seam, leaving the sides and that bottom piece open. So now the two halves of the body are complete, and we're getting ready to sew these side seam together. First though, we want to attach the ears. And as you can see, these are the updated ears that I made. So in addition to them being a bit shorter, this time when I added that little fold, I did so at an angle, and I think this angle looks a lot better than the first attempt I did, which was just like a straight kind of fabric fold. I think this angle shape makes it look a lot more like a natural ear shape. I also used the paper pattern piece to draw the seam line on the ears again, and that just helps me match up the seam line on the ear with the seam line on the head so that I know if the ears are being attached evenly. Now, this next step involves some mental calculating. You want to attach the ear so that the ear faces the correct way, with the fold facing the front. So I had to pause a little bit to think this out. I'm pinning the ear on the right side of the back of the headpiece with the front of the ears facing up. So you can see me testing out how the ears will fold up once everything's all sewn together to make sure that I've got things facing the right way. Then I just quickly run over to the sewing machine where I sewed the two ears in place, sewing within the seam allowance because I don't want these stitches to be visible on the finished Firey. Then I can come back and pin the back half of the Firey body to the front half, again making sure to line up the seams. That like weird curvy line that we so painstakingly sewed, that seam should line up on each half of the Firey. So make sure that those are lined up, and then just run over to your sewing machine and sew up these sides of the Firey. Again, do not sew up that bottom edge of the Firey, just sew up the side seams. And that's it. That's the sewing done, or at least the blast of the machine sewing. Now we need to turn all of our sewn pieces inside out so we can cram them full of stuffing and then sew up the various gaps. So let's focus on the limbs first. By the way, if you're like me and you use the heat erase pen, this is the point where I'd recommend ironing all the limbs to remove those lines. This is also the point where you need to cut the fabric in between the toes and the fingers, which as you can see is a pretty narrow space, so obviously be careful here. And then as you can see, I'm going through and doing the same thing I did before with the ears and the tail, where I am clipping corners, clipping valleys, notching mountains, all that jazz. Turning the thin pieces inside out is easier said than done. I do need to once again warn folks that you need to be very careful with the fingers and the toes. Since the seam allowance here is very small, it's really easy to use too much force and rip the fabric. If you do rip the fabric in these areas, all may not be lost. I have done that before in the past, and I've been able to use the ladder stitch to patch things up. I'll get into the ladder stitch shortly, but for now, just try and be careful when turning your fabric. Oh, also, this is me attempting to demonstrate how you can turn these thin parts without using the pinchy tool. This is how I did my first few fireys without the pinchy tool, is using a straw and a wooden dowel on either side of the fabric. It's basically trying to replicate the pinchy tool and doing the same rolling motion to roll the fabric up to turn it inside out. This way does work. It's definitely a lot more fiddly than the pinchy tool though, mostly because you could hold the pinchy tool one-handed, and the straw and the wooden dowel, you kind of have to either have a third arm or figure out some kind of position to have one resting against the ground while you're trying to rule things. Once you've got things turned inside out, just start stuffing them. For the thin parts of the fiery, especially the fingers and the toes, just use little clumps of the stuffing and something like a wooden dowel to shove it in place. Don't try and cram in a whole lot of stuffing in at once, because that's probably just going to lead to you ripping a seam when you're just trying to cram too much stuffing into too narrow of a space. Also, this is why I would recommend making sure your gaps are on the palm or the foot, because this step is way harder if you left the gap on one of the thin parts of the limbs and you don't have a lot of area to work with when you're trying to shove the stuffing into place. To sew up those gaps, we are going to use the ladder stitch. This is a super valuable stitch that I'd recommend everybody learn how to do. It comes in handy for situations like this, where you want to close up a bit of sewing without the thread being visible from the outside. So as I mentioned, if you pop a seam on your fiery, you might be able to use the stitch to close it back up. You basically sew a ladder shape going back and forth on either side of your sewing. I don't quite know if I'm demonstrating it properly here, so I will link a video in the description that I think shows this a lot better. But you basically sew a few stitches and then pull your thread to close those stitches, and you repeat that until the gap is closed. Fun fact, but I've seen this referred to as the Henson stitch, because this is either the same or very similar stitch to what Jim Henson and his company used when making their puppets. While you're sewing up the gap on the legs, there's an extra step that you could do here. Completely optional, but I really like the look that it gives the foot. The Fiery Plush in the film has a slight bend to his foot. And to replicate that, I like to just kind of fold up the foot and the leg and create like a little fold in the fabric where the ankle would be. Then I go over that fold with the ladder stitch, which makes the bend permanent. Now, I don't know if this is proper knotting technique. This is just what I do, at least. But once I finish sewing up the gap, I knot my thread a few times, and then I push my sewing needle in and out of whatever I'm sewing, pulling the thread taut, and then I clip the thread. And then that way, once you release the tension on the thread, the tail of the knot is hidden inside whatever you just sewed. So all the limbs are sewn up, time to turn the body inside out. Again, you want to make sure to clip corners and curves and all of that. Also, I don't know if this makes a difference, but I like to go through and make sure that at these points where I've sewn over the seam allowance that I'm adding in a cut to free the fabric a bit. I don't know if this actually does something, but at the very least I've convinced myself it does. Also, if you've noticed, I haven't ironed the body here. I wanted to leave the seam lines on until after I've sewn on the bottom piece of the Firey. Although if you really wanted to, you could iron the rest of the Firey and just try and avoid the bottom edge. The body is definitely the easiest thing to turn inside out because we have this nice big hole at the bottom where his butt will be. Then you just gotta start cramming your stuffing into the head and body. Stuffing the body is the one time that I'm grateful that I have tiny baby hands, because I could squeeze my hand through the neck into the head and make sure that the nose is super nicely packed. If you have larger hands, then I guess you're back to using the wooden dowel to try and push things into place. Once you've got the head and body nicely stuffed, it's time to sew on that bottom piece to the Firey's butt. I'm lining up the notches with the side seams of the Firey. Not doing so results in a Firey with a weirdly angled butt. Also, the Firey's bottom is another piece that has a bit of gathering to it, so if you found the machine gathering helpful earlier, then I'd also suggest doing it here. Then you just need to sew around the bottom of the body with the ladder stitch. Just sew along the drawn seam lines, knot the thread once you reach the other side, and there you go, you've got the body sewing all done. This is also the point where I went over the body with my iron, just going over all the seams and making sure that that drawn line is fully removed. So now we need to attach all of the limbs to the body. If you want, you could get some Velcro dots and sew those onto the limbs and the body, and that way your Firey plush can actually be taken apart like the living ones in the film do. I'm going to sew my Firey together, and so that means I'm using the ladder stitch once again. I just position the limbs where I think looks good, and then I use the ladder stitch. I like to stitch the front and the back of each limb to make sure it's really firmly attached to the body. For the arms, I originally sewed them on following the seam line, as shown in the clip here. But I realized that this kind of makes the armpits look a little weird. I did like the height of the arm though, so I marked that with the heat erase pen, and then I re-sewed the arms on so that they were perpendicular to the seam, which I think looks a lot better. And there we are! The body is fully assembled. So now we get to do what is probably the most fun part of this project, which is adding all of the yarn fur. I'm going to show you a few different ways to add on the yarn fur, so feel free to take whatever method you like best and use that for your Firey, or mix and match like I'm doing here. Firstly though, on the subject of yarn colors, the Firey in the film has lots of different colors of yarn on him. There's some pale yellow, orange, there's various shades of pinks and purples. That's a lot of individual yarn to pick up. If you don't want to go that route, an alternative I can suggest is to pick up this particular multicolored yarn. This is the Red Heart Super Saver Stripes in the Fruity Stripe colorway. There's a lot of nice shades of orange, there's some pinky reds and yellows in this ball. So what I like to do is unwind the yarn and cut out the different colors and collect them all. The only downside to this yarn is that you don't know exactly how much of each shade you're going to get. If you want a super full and fluffy Firey, I'd recommend getting at least 2 balls of this yarn. Oh, and this is something I only noticed when I had already added some yarn onto the Firey, but either this yarn changed ever so slightly since I last bought some, or I picked up a weird batch on this latest go-around. The new yarn is a lot more desaturated. It's not terrible by any means, but there is a noticeable difference. So I guess that's something to be aware of if you're using this same yarn to make your own Firey. If you can, try and get it in stores so you can verify the colors will match. I also have this pale purple yarn and this pale yellow that you saw me use earlier for the tail. I got both of these balls of yarn from the thrift store, so that's another option for folks if you're looking to save a few bucks. To attach the yarn, I'd highly recommend picking up a large-eyed needle and this little pin threader tool. If you're gonna pick anything up, pick up this tool and pinchy, but mostly this tool. It was pretty cheap, and it makes threading the needle with the yarn so much easier and 10 times faster. Like, you have no idea how much I previously struggled to try and thread thick, like fluffy yarn through a tiny needle hole. It's a pain. Don't want to do it again. And I will never do it again now that I have discovered this nifty little threader tool. Anyways, the first way of adding yarn to your fiery is just to sew it on. I'm adding some pale yellow to the wrists. I just cut some of the yarn, threaded it through the needle, and now I'm just poking the yarn through the fiery a few times. But notice I'm not pulling the thread taut. I'm deliberately leaving some dangly loops here. Then when I've got a few dangly loops, I go back and snip them. Then I go through and I knot 2 of the threads together, which secures them in place. If you want them extra secure, you can maybe put a bit of glue or fray check on the knot to make sure that it can't be untied. I use the same method to add some yarn to the elbows of the fiery, and I'm also going to do the same for the fluff that goes on the back of the fiery's legs. But this time, instead of doing a slightly random assortment of stitches, I'm just trying my best to do a straight line up the center back of each of the fiery's legs. I'd recommend trying to group the yarn a bit closer than I'm doing in the video. I did find I had to go back and fill in some of the gaps off camera. Okay, here's the second method of adding yarn to your fiery. I'm taking a length of yarn and wrapping that around the bottom of the fiery to get the rough circumference of the body, marking the measurement with a knot on either end of the thread. We're now going to take our little makeshift yarn belt and make a little yarn tutu. I want to cut a lot of yarn into about 4.5-inch long pieces, so I cut a bit of foam core 4.5 inches long, and I wrap my yarn around it. Now you want to avoid stretching the yarn as you're wrapping it around the foam core, because that'll just mess up the length. But once you've got a bit of yarn wrapped, you cut the yarn free on both ends, and then you have a nice little pile of cut yarn. For my fiery, I'm doing 3 main colors for the tutu. I've got a yellow, orange, and this pinky red, but feel free to customize your fiery to your liking. Once you have your piles of yarn, you're going to do what's called an overhand knot. You're basically knotting a piece of yarn over and around the yarn belt. It's admittedly a tricky thing to describe in narration, so I'm hoping that the video makes it clear enough what I'm doing here. You just keep doing that over and over, slowly building up the yarn tutu. The more densely you pack on the yarn pieces, the fluffier yarn tutu you'll get. To attach the tutu to the fiery, the best way to do so in my opinion is to just use more of those cut pieces of yarn and your needle. If you can manage to thread it anyways. You just sew one of your cut yarn pieces onto the body at the point that you want to attach the tutu, and then use that piece to tie the tutu in place. And as a bonus, the tie blends in seamlessly with the rest of the tutu. You can add in as many ties as you like. I think for my fiery, I added one around every inch to 1.5 inches apart. Here's my yarn tutu all attached. I don't know why I insist on petting all the yarn once I've applied it to the fiery. I guess that's just what I do when I don't know what I'm doing for the shot. I'm gonna add the yarn around the fiery's neck the same way, only this time I went around the neck twice, and I also used some of the yarn ties to plan out where I wanted this little patchy orange yarn to appear on my fiery. And here's the finished and attached neck tutu. As you can see, I added in some of the purple yarn here, as well as some smaller bits of purple embroidery thread. I also used the tutu method to make this yarn halo as a start on the Fiery's head hair. I'm just using it to plan out what's going to be the perimeter of the hair. We're going to fill in that big bald spot with the next method of adding yarn. This method is what I like to call the lazy person's pom-pom. Basically, I just take a pile of cut yarn pieces, then I tie that bundle together with another bit of yarn to make a floppy pom-pom. I made a bunch of these in a variety of colors. This solid yellow one, a super multicolored one for the top of the Fiery's head, and then the rest are either fully red or red with a bit of orange mixed in. I'm showing 11 different pom-poms here. I did end up having to make a few extras to completely fill in the Fiery's head. If you want an idea of how many yarn pom-poms you need, you can temporarily pin them in and see how things are looking. The adding of the pom-poms is very much to your own discretion. Add however many as you like, in whatever places you like. I've made a few of these Fieries now, and they always turn out a bit different than the last, which I honestly think is kind of cool. The Fieries in the film didn't all look the same, so I like that every Fiery plush is unique too. Attaching the yarn pom-poms is the same method as attaching the yarn tutus. Using another section of cotton yarn, you just tie them in place around the middle. I find it's best just to tie it in the same place you had previously tied the pom-pom bundle together. I should note, with these lazy pom-poms, if you pull hard enough, you can pluck out some of the pieces of the yarn. I don't think I could recommend this method of adding yarn if you are making the Fiery for a young kid. Maybe if you added, like, a ton of glue to the knot to better secure the individual threads. I guess this is a good point to mention that I don't know how these plush toys would hold up with young kids. I've only ever made them for other adult collectors. But if your Fiery is just going to sit on a shelf for the majority of its life, this is the easiest way to add in a massive amount of fluff in a short amount of time. Oh, I should point out, I started using a pair of pliers here. If you find it hard at all to pull the needle through the Fiery's head, the extra leverage that you can get from a pair of pliers is a huge help. With the yarn attached, we are very nearly done with our Fiery. We just gotta finish up the face, which includes adding the eyes and mouth. Adding the eyes and mouth is slightly tricky because you of course want to try and make it somewhat symmetrical. I used pins to plan things out, then I busted out the heat erase pen one last time just to add a few small dots so I know where to stick the thread for both the mouth and the eyes. Although, before adding the eyes, I'm just going to quickly add in a few eyelashes for the Fiery, using the first method of attaching yarn I used in the video. You can always add these on after the eyes if you're uncertain about your eye placement. It's just a little trickier with the buttons in the way. To attach the eyes and add the mouth, I'm going to use some black embroidery thread that's knotted on the end, and the longest needle that I have. I'm starting on one of the eyes, and basically just sewing the button in place according to the guides I added. I'm using buttons that are about 1.25 inches wide. If you notice, these are 4-hole buttons, and the Fiery in the film has 2-hole button eyes. I've had the hardest time trying to find large, white, 2-hole buttons. Eventually I gave up and just used the 4-hole ones you see here in the video. Of course, it was only after I finished my Fiery and started editing this video that I visited my local Michaels store and finally found some large 2-hole buttons. Little annoyed at that, but I guess it's good to know that they are out there, waiting to show themselves only when it's most inconvenient to do so. Anyways, once I'm done with the eye, I'm going to sew directly through the eye and out the cheek at one of those little marker dots that I added, and that's how I'm going to start adding the mouth. Now I kind of winged this a little bit, and you can kind of tell I don't quite know what I'm doing, but I'm basically just trying to sew this little smile line with the thread. I went over the smile line twice to build up the thread a bit. And then for the actual smile of the fiery, I just ran the thread underneath the fiery's nose and sewed back into the opposite cheek to create that second smile line. Once again, I'm going through the smile line twice to build it up a little bit more. Then from that smile line, I just went back in through the cheek and out the other eye, and then proceeded to sew on the second button. To finish this off, you just need to tie a knot in the embroidery thread, and so long as you've got a big enough button, the knot will remain hidden behind that button. And that's it! That's the fully completed fiery. I sincerely hope that this video tutorial inspires people to make their own fiery plush. If you're not sure if you can accomplish this, just try it. Like, what's the worst thing that could happen? I guess maybe you sew through a finger, but just don't do that. just don't do that. Yeah, just try it. I don't know how to do half of what I try every day of my life, and yet somehow it's working out, and I've been able to make some really cool things for myself. So just you try it. By the way, if you do use this tutorial to make your own fiery, I would love to see the result. You can find me on Instagram, Tumblr, Facebook, Twitter. I'm there as KO Makes Things. And yeah, please seek me out. Show me what you've made. I would love to see what you create. You know, I feel like even if it's indirectly, I'm making people happy. You know, I've helped them in some small way to accomplish something really cool, and that hopefully has made you smile, because it certainly makes me smile. Anyways, I could go on. This video is long enough already though, so I'm gonna try and wrap it up. I do hope to make more videos like this in the future. I for sure want to show how to make the rest of the plush trio, the Ludo and Didymus plushes. But I think I'm gonna take a little bit of a break from the sewing heavy tutorials for a bit. This video kicked my butt a little bit, I'm not gonna lie. I think I very nearly bit off more than I could chew with this one. But yeah, so we'll see what ends up being the next thing I slap onto YouTube. And yeah, until then, thank you for tuning in.